Okay, welcome back, everyone. Hope you're doing well today. We're going to do a Rashi, a couple of small Rashis actually, from the fourth aliyah of the combined parshios of Behar, Bechuk. And I think they'll prove to be interesting, although they are Rashis that relate to mitzvahs that we don't really deal with today. So in certain sense, they're not relevant to us, but in another sense, I think they're quite interesting to explore nonetheless. The parsha gets into, as we mentioned the last day or two, the topic of Jewish slaves, because of course the topic of Shemitah and Yovel leads into the renunciation of loans, to the return of property, to the return of slaves. So we get into kind of in the aftermath of that, the discussion of what it means to be a Jewish slave. The parsha delineates some of the differences between a Jewish slave and a non-Jewish slave, an Eved Ivri, an Eved Knani. Many pages of Gemara just dealing with these kinds of mitzvos and many complexities to it. I mentioned this morning after davening in our Rashi, one of the particular angles to it of what we're not the way we're supposed to treat an Eved Ivri, many different aspects to it in terms of the respect that we're supposed to show. I want to show a few this afternoon that I didn't talk about this morning and get into some of the parameters of that. So the Torah tells us, "V'chiyamuch achicha imach v'nim karlach lo savod bo avodas aved." When a person becomes impoverished and they're forced to sell themselves to you in order to pay off a debt or for whatever other reason, they become your Eved Ivri, they become your Jewish slave. When that's the case, the main injunction is lo savod bo avodas aved. You shouldn't treat him with the work of a slave. So what does the work of a slave mean? So Rashi gives an example, avodas aved, avoda shel ganai, disgraceful kinds of work that we would normally associate with slaves, whatever slaves mean out there in the world. So the normal avoda of a slave is not something you're actually allowed to give to an Eved Ivri. Nikar ba ke'eved. You can't give him the type of work or her the type of work that would be recognizable, that they would be known and seen and recognized as an Eved, right? What does that mean? Shelo yolich kelav acharav bebeis hamerchatz v'lo yinalo min alav. You're not allowed to force your Eved Ivri or ask your Eved Ivri to help you put on your shoes, to carry your bag to the bathhouse. Those kinds of things were known types of work that were designated for slaves. And so you might want to give them this task because after all, they're working for you or they're your servant, however you want to phrase it, but that would be beyond the pale. That would be too much. That's avoda shel gnai, that's disgraceful kind of work, demeaning kind of work, the work that brands them as a slave. And that's exactly what we're forbidden to do. So what are you allowed to do with your Eved Ivri if you're not allowed to make them avodas aved? You're not allowed to give them slave types of work. What you're allowed to do is kisachir kitoshav imach. They're supposed to be with you like a hired servant, like a type of worker that you would have not as a slave, but just as a hired worker. So they're allowed to engage in the types of work that no one would know the difference whether they're a hired worker or an eved, whether they're paying off a debt or whether you're actually paying them a salary. What are those kinds of work? Avodas karka, meleches umnus, kishar sechirim, isnaigbo. You're allowed to give them work in the fields. You're allowed to give them certain types of craftsmanship work, things that you would hire others, kishar sechirim, like other hired workers would do for you. You're allowed to give that kind of work to them as a way for them to repay their loan without you paying them. But to the outside world, it would not be recognizable. And to the individual, it would not be demeaning. There's thousands of aspects, really, literally, to the idea of treating a slave, an Eved Ivri, with the proper kind of respect and the proper kind of status and not embarrassing them in the process. This is just one of them, but I think it's symptomatic of the rest or emblematic of the rest and something that can give you a little bit of a flavor of the way the Torah understood the relationship between the master and the slave, between the Adon and the Eved. It's really more like the relationship between a hired worker and an employer rather than between a master and a slave as we imagine it to be. That's one aspect I wanted to talk about. One of the other things that's forbidden is for us to treat the Eved Ivri, lo sirdebo befarech. You're not allowed to give them parech. Now, we know that word from Mitzrayim. That's the word that's described, the word that's used to describe the work that Paro gave us, avodas parech, cited in the Haggadah. We talk about it at Pesach time. But what is avodas parech? We're not allowed to burden them with avodas parech. So Rashi here explains it. It fits very much into the context of Mitzrayim, but it also gives us further insight into what we're not allowed to do to the Eved Ivri here in this relationship. Lo tirdebo b'parech, malacha shelo litzorech kedei la'anoso. You're not allowed to give them mindless, purposeless work simply to make them suffer. There's certain psychological degradation. So even though you're allowed to give them avodas karka, let's say, working the fields, because it's not recognizable as an avodah shel genai, that's what we learned up here, you're allowed to give them work that any other worker would have. So you could tell them to go harvest your field. However, even within those categories of work, which are not in and of themselves demeaning, you're not allowed to force them to do that work if there's no purpose to it, if you don't actually need them to do that work. Al tomarlo, says Rashi, don't say to them, don't say to him, go wash these dishes, go wash this cup, even though they washed it 10 times already, it's perfectly clean. You just want to see them work. You want to get your money's worth. You want to take advantage of them. That's avodas parech. That's an overly burdensome kind of work because it crushes the spirit. It crushes the soul. It's indicative specifically of a master-slave relationship because it's saying to the person, I don't actually need your services. All I want to do is make sure you feel lower than me. Make sure you know who's the master. That kind of psychological degradation, in addition to the physical degradations, which we're not allowed to engage with, that kind of psychological, emotional degradation is something we have to stay away from as well. It helps us to understand the avodas parach of the slaves in Egypt. We as Jews were not only enslaved because we had to work for Paro, and because we had to work to build an empire that was not our own, and we had to do so many things that were foreign to us, but also because that avodah was avodas parach. It was mindless, sometimes mindless, purposeless work, just to cause us to suffer, just to cause us to recognize who was the master over us. And it was particularly demeaning to our spirit, so much so that not only religiously, but emotionally, we were at the 49th level of Tumah. We were crushed down so much. Kadosh Baruch Hu, in taking us out of Egypt, we see this in so many aspects of it. The story of retelling that we retell in Pesach, Hashem had to build us up as people, not just as Jews, not just as people committed to build us up as human beings again, because we had become so demoted in terms of our status. And so putting that here into our sugya now of the Eved Ivri, the idea of the way we treat slaves is so important, not just from a physical standpoint, sociological standpoint, but from an emotional standpoint as well. Have a great day, everybody, and take good care.